Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the bloodiest and most infamous civil wars in the history of the Imperium, the Badab War. This wasn't just another rebellion. This was Astartes against Astartes. A brutal clash between some of the Emperor's finest warriors, driven by duty, ambition, and betrayal. It's a story of brotherhood shattered, of warriors who once stood shoulder to shoulder, now turning bolters against each other, and of a conflict that left scars on the Imperium that never truly healed. If you think the Horus Heresy was the last time Space Marines fought each other in such numbers, think again. The Badab War was not on the same galactic scale, but for those who fought in it, it was nothing short of apocalyptic. It was a war waged not for chaos, not for Xenos, not for some ancient prophecy, but for power, survival, and vengeance. And what makes it so fascinating is that it wasn't a simple case of traitors versus loyalists. The truth is far messier, and even centuries later, there are those who question who was truly in the right. So how did it all begin? What drove some of the most disciplined warriors of the Imperium to open fire on their own kin? Who were the key players, and what were their real motivations? And most importantly, what were the long-term consequences of this war? Because while the Badab War ended long ago, its echoes still haunt the Imperium to this day. To understand the full scope of this conflict, we have to start at the beginning. And that means looking at the seeds of rebellion, the political tensions, and the key figures who set the stage for one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. The Badab War didn't just explode out of nowhere. Like most great conflicts in the Imperium, it was a slow burn. Years of growing tension, bureaucratic overreach, and a space marine ruler who saw himself as the only thing standing between his people and total collapse. And honestly, it's not hard to see why he thought that way. The Imperium's bureaucracy is legendary for its inefficiency, and the events leading up to this war are a textbook example of how it crushes those who can't keep up. At the heart of it all was Luft Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws. Before he became one of the Imperium's most infamous renegades, he was a celebrated commander, a loyal Astartes who took his duty to the Imperium seriously. Perhaps too seriously. His chapter had been tasked with defending the Maelstrom Zone, one of the most dangerous and volatile regions of Imperial space. This was no easy assignment. The Maelstrom was a hotbed of Xenos raiders, chaos incursions, and rogue warlords, and for decades, the Astral Claws fought tirelessly to hold the line. But here's where things started going wrong. The Imperium demands loyalty, and loyalty is measured in tithes, the endless quotas of resources, manpower, and service that every Imperial faction must pay. For Space Marine chapters, that means committing troops to larger campaigns when the High Lords demand it. But in the Maelstrom, every Astartes was needed just to keep the region from collapsing into anarchy. Huron argued that the constant demands from Terra were unreasonable, even dangerous. If he diverted forces away, the entire sector could fall. He pleaded for more resources, but as is often the case, those pleas fell on deaf ears. Then came the breaking point. The Adeptus Administratum, ever the soulless machine of Imperial governance, started treating Huron's refusal to send forces as a rebellion against Imperial authority, not as a strategic decision, not as a desperate measure. A rebellion. And in the Imperium, there's no such thing as a small rebellion. The hammer always falls hard. Orders were sent to audit and investigate the Astral Claws, and that's when Huron made his choice. He would not submit. Instead of bowing to the demands of bureaucrats who didn't understand the battlefield, he doubled down. He fortified Badab, consolidated his power, and took control of the region outright. In his mind, he wasn't betraying the Imperium, he was saving it from itself. Of course, from the outside, this looked like outright insubordination. The Administratum, and more importantly, the Astra Militarum, now had justification to act. But sending Imperial Guard regiments against entrenched Space Marines was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. So instead, they sent other Astartes. And just like that, the seeds of the Badab War had fully taken root. There's a lot of debate in the Warhammer community about whether Huron was ever truly a traitor at this stage. Some believe that he was just a pragmatic leader, doing what was necessary to ensure the survival of his chapter and the Maelstrom. Others argue that his arrogance and ambition played just as big a role, that he had become obsessed with his own power and saw himself as a warlord rather than a servant of the emperor. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between. But one thing is certain: by refusing to bow to the Imperium's demands, Huron forced their hand. There was no going back. And once the Imperium decides that someone is an enemy, there's only one possible outcome: total war. Luft Huron was not always the dreaded tyrant of the Maelstrom, nor the infamous warlord of the Red Corsairs. He was once a proud and loyal chapter master, a warrior who fought with relentless efficiency and unwavering devotion to the Imperium. If anything, he was a model Astartes leader, until he wasn't. His fall wasn't some dramatic betrayal in the name of chaos. It wasn't a sudden moment of weakness or corruption. It was a slow, deliberate descent, one that raises an uncomfortable question. Was he ever truly wrong, or was he simply a victim of the Imperium's own brutal logic? From the beginning, Huron was different from other chapter masters. He was ruthless, but not reckless, ambitious, but undeniably effective. His astral claws had been given an impossible task: defend the Maelstrom zone with minimal resources against enemies that never stopped coming. And against all odds, he did it. He didn't just survive, he expanded, fortifying his holdings, strengthening his fleets, and creating a regional power base that rivaled entire sectors. This wasn't the act of a man who wanted to rebel. It was the act of a man who believed the Imperium had abandoned him and that only he could keep order. But here's where things started to twist. As the pressure from Terra mounted, Huron stopped seeing himself as just a chapter master. He started acting like a ruler. He saw the Maelstrom Warders, the coalition of chapters assigned to the region, not as equals, but as vassals. He believed that his authority should supersede that of the Imperium's distant bureaucrats, because they didn't understand the reality of the war being fought on the fringes of space. And in a way, he wasn't entirely wrong. The Imperium often sacrifices entire populations for the sake of its own inefficiency. Why should the astral claws be any different? But the problem with power is that once you have it, you start thinking you deserve it. And the more Huron consolidated his rule, the more he crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. He absorbed other chapters' resources, overruled their leadership, and eventually treated them as nothing more than extensions of his own will. What started as a necessary defense became an empire in the making, and that's when the Imperium stepped in. When the first Imperial forces arrived to demand his compliance, Huron didn't back down. He didn't see them as reinforcements, but as invaders. Imperial forces that had come not to help, but to strip his power away. And when the war began, it was not out of desperation, but conviction. Huron truly believed that what he was doing was right. He saw the High Lords of Terra as incompetent, their demands as suicidal, and their governance as outdated. His war was not one of heresy, but of independence. And if that meant fighting other space marines, so be it. This is where the real tragedy of Huron's fall begins. If he had simply been another power-hungry warlord, his descent would have been straightforward. But he wasn't. He was a man who believed in his own righteousness, and that made him dangerous. He didn't see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as the only true protector of the Imperium's frontier, the only one willing to make the hard choices. And yet, despite all his strategic brilliance, he underestimated one thing. The Imperium doesn't tolerate defiance. As the war dragged on and his forces dwindled, Huron became more extreme. His paranoia grew. He executed allies who questioned his rule, used forbidden tactics to maintain his grip, and turned to increasingly brutal measures. And then, the final blow. Badab itself was invaded and razed. Huron was gravely wounded, barely surviving the battle, and his chapter was annihilated. The astral claws were no more. But Huron? He was far from done. This is where Luft Huron ceased to exist, and the tyrant of Badab truly emerged. He fled into the Maelstrom, but he didn't go alone. He took with him those who had survived, those who still believed in his cause, and those who simply had nowhere else to go. The Imperium had branded him a traitor, so he embraced the role they forced upon him. He carved out a new empire, not as an imperial governor, but as a warlord of the void. He was no longer fighting for the Imperium. He was fighting against it. And so the Red Corsairs were born. There's a lot of debate among fans about whether Huron ever truly embraced chaos, or if he simply became what the Imperium had already decided he was. Some believe he was always doomed to fall, that his arrogance and ambition would have led him down this path no matter what. Others argue that if the Imperium had just supported him instead of opposing him, the war could have been avoided entirely. But one thing is undeniable: Huron's transformation wasn't a moment of weakness or surrender. It was a deliberate choice, a final act of defiance against the Imperium that had turned on him. The Badab War may have ended, but its consequences didn't. Huron didn't die, and the Red Corsairs became one of the most dangerous renegade factions in the galaxy. To this day, they terrorize Imperial space, raiding, pillaging, and growing in power. The Imperium's attempt to erase Huron failed. If anything, it only made him stronger. And that raises an interesting question. If the Imperium had simply treated Huron differently, if they had negotiated instead of condemned, if they had recognized his victories instead of demanding his obedience, could this war have been avoided? Or was it inevitable from the start? Whatever the case, one thing is clear. Luft Huron is not just a fallen space marine. He is a symbol of what happens when loyalty and ambition collide, and of the thin line between hero and heretic. The Badab War wasn't just a fight between the Astral Claws and the Imperium. It was a schism within the Adeptus Astartes, a war where battle brothers had to choose between loyalty to their oaths and loyalty to their own survival. And when Space Marines are forced to take sides, the lines between right and wrong blur fast. This wasn't like the Horus Heresy, where chaos divided the legions. There were no dark gods whispering in ears, no demonic bargains, just Space Marines, the Emperor's chosen warriors, standing on opposite sides of the battlefield, convinced they were fighting for the right cause. At the heart of it all was Luft Huron and his allies, the chapters that decided to stand with him rather than against him. Some fought because they believed in his vision, some fought because they had no choice, and some fought because they had already been pulled too deep into his rule. The Mantis warriors, the Lamenters, and the Executioners were the most infamous among them. These were not traitors in the traditional sense. These were Space Marines who believed they were still fighting for the Imperium, just not in the way the High Lords of Terra wanted them to. The Mantis warriors were an elite, but relatively isolated chapter, and their proximity to the Maelstrom meant they were already deeply involved in its defense. To them, Huron wasn't some power-hungry tyrant. He was the only one willing to do what was necessary to keep their world safe. They saw the Imperium's orders as short-sighted and destructive, a political game played by bureaucrats who didn't understand what it was like to fight on the front lines. When the war broke out, they committed fully to Huron's cause, believing that they were fighting for the Imperium, not against it. The Lamenters, on the other hand, are one of the most tragic examples of how fate plays cruel tricks on the Astartes. A Blood Angel's successor chapter, they were already cursed with horrible luck and a tragic history, constantly sent on the worst campaigns, suffering unbearable losses. And when they were assigned to support Huron, they were trapped. They didn't start as true believers in his cause, but once the Imperium declared him a traitor, they were already too deep. If they turned against him, they would have been seen as traitors anyway. So they committed to the war out of sheer necessity. Many fans see the Lamenters as a cautionary tale, proof that even the most loyal chapters can be forced into rebellion when the Imperium refuses to show mercy. Then there were the Executioners, a brutal traditionalist chapter that respected power above all else. They didn't necessarily care about Huron's ideology, but they saw him as a strong leader who had earned their loyalty. In their eyes, this wasn't about imperial politics. It was about honor and duty. They had sworn an oath to fight alongside him, and they wouldn't break that oath just because the High Lords of Terra said so. Even when things started turning against them, they remained one of the most relentless forces on the battlefield, refusing to abandon their allies until the bitter end. But for every chapter that stood with Huron, there were others that opposed him. And the Imperium doesn't lack for loyal warriors. The Firehawks, the Marines Errant, the Red Scorpions, and many others were called upon to bring the rebels to heel. Unlike Huron's forces, these chapters weren't driven by personal loyalty or regional concerns. They were there because the Imperium had given them an order, and they obeyed. The Red Scorpions, in particular, were among the most zealous in their prosecution of the war. They are a chapter that holds the Codex Astartes as absolute law, seeing deviation from it as heresy. To them, Huron's refusal to submit wasn't just rebellion, it was heresy in its purest form. They didn't just fight against him, they actively hunted down his forces with brutal efficiency, determined to erase his legacy completely. There's a lot of debate about whether the Red Scorpions were too extreme, but from their perspective, there was no room for nuance. The Imperium had spoken, and the Imperium was never wrong. The Firehawks were another key force in the war, though their involvement was less about zealotry and more about opportunity. They were a chapter known for their recklessness and aggression, and the chance to engage in a full-scale war against other Astartes was something they relished. They weren't fighting for some greater ideological cause. They were fighting because they were good at it, and the Imperium had given them permission to go all out. Some fans even argue that the Firehawks were a blunt instrument used by the Imperium to escalate the war, rather than de-escalate it. And then there were the Marines Errant, a chapter that was more pragmatic than fanatical. They weren't as aggressive as the Firehawks or as dogmatic as the Red Scorpions, but they were utterly loyal to the Imperium. Their role in the war was more strategic, engaging in precise calculated strikes against Huron's forces. They weren't in it for vengeance or ideology, they were there because the Imperium needed them to be. The most interesting part of the Badab War is that this wasn't a black and white conflict. There were no Chaos warbands, no Xenos manipulation, just Space Marines forced to choose between duty and survival. Some chapters fought because they believed Huron was right. Others fought because they had no choice. Some fought for the Imperium out of blind obedience, while others fought simply because it was another war to win. And that's what makes this war so different from something like the Horus Heresy. There was no grand rebellion, no dark gods pulling the strings. Just a slow, painful descent into civil war, one decision at a time. And even after it was all over, the scars never fully healed. The Lamenters were nearly wiped out, their reputation forever tarnished. The Mantis warriors were forced into exile, their loyalty questioned for centuries. Even the loyalist chapters that fought against Huron weren't left unscathed. Many of them suffered horrific casualties, losing battle brothers to a war that, in hindsight, might have been avoidable. The Badab War wasn't just a war between Space Marines. It was a test of what it truly meant to be loyal to the Imperium, and a reminder that, in the grim darkness of the far future, even the Emperor's finest can find themselves on the wrong side of history. When the first shots of the Badab War were fired, they weren't a declaration of outright rebellion. There was no single moment where Huron stood up and screamed defiance at the Imperium. No dramatic betrayal where chaos whispers corrupted his mind. No, the war began like so many others in the Imperium, not with a bang, but with a series of small, seemingly isolated conflicts that quickly spiraled out of control. At first, it was all about control over supply routes, trade lanes, and strategic star systems. Huron had been refusing tithes and ignoring orders from Terra, but the Imperium hadn't sent a full invasion force to deal with him just yet. Instead, they tested the waters, sending small-scale fleets and punitive actions to force him back in line. And that's where things got ugly. Huron wasn't about to roll over. He knew the Imperium would push back, so he made sure he was ready. His forces struck first, targeting Imperial patrols, supply convoys, and any force that tried to assert control over the Maelstrom Zone. These weren't reckless attacks. Huron was a master strategist, and he understood that he wasn't fighting an open war yet. This was a game of positioning. He used hit-and-run tactics, drawing enemy forces into carefully laid traps, destroying key assets, and making sure that every engagement cost the Imperium more than it cost him. One of the first major clashes happened when Imperial forces attempted to reassert control over trade lanes in the region. The Firehawks, a chapter known for their aggression, were tasked with securing a foothold. They expected minor resistance. After all, These were still Astartes on the other side, and the idea of open war between Space Marines was still unthinkable to most. But Huron had no interest in playing by the Imperium's rules. His fleets ambushed the Firehawks, launching a brutal boarding assault that left entire strike cruisers burning in the void. It was a message, one that said, "I will not bow." This was the turning point. The Imperium couldn't ignore it anymore. What had started as a dispute was now an active military conflict, and both sides knew there was no going back. The Imperium responded by calling in more chapters, Marines errant, Red Scorpions, and others, to put Huron down before things escalated further. But the problem was, Huron had been preparing for this for years. He had fortified Badab, turned the Maelstrom Zone into a fortress, and created a network of loyalist Astartes who were willing to fight alongside him. This is where the war became something truly unique. Unlike most conflicts in the Imperium, which involve massive planetary battles, sector-wide campaigns, or chaos-driven cataclysms, the Badab War was fought like a chess match in the void. It wasn't about planetary invasions or exterminatus-level destruction, at least not at first. It was about fleet actions, precision strikes, and tactical maneuvering. Both sides knew they couldn't afford to waste resources. The Loyalist forces were fighting at the edge of the Imperium, far from reinforcements, while Huron was fighting for his survival, using every advantage he had to make sure the Imperium paid for every inch of ground. One of the most fascinating aspects of this war was how much trust and deception played a role. Huron didn't just rely on brute force. He used misdirection, misinformation, and psychological warfare. He made the Imperium think he was weaker than he was, retreating from battles only to strike back in unexpected places. He planted false intelligence, tricking Imperial forces into overcommitting and then hitting them where they were weakest. In many ways, this was a war fought with the mind, just as much as with bolters and chainswords. Of course, it wasn't long before the fighting became more personal. Space Marines are warriors, but they are also brothers, and for many of them, this war was a nightmare come to life. There are stories of battles where entire squads hesitated before firing, moments where Astartes recognized the heraldry of an old comrade and faltered. But there was no mercy in this war. Hesitation meant death, and as the conflict dragged on, those moments of uncertainty disappeared. This was no longer a war of words. It was a war where every strike was meant to kill. One of the early engagements that set the tone for the rest of the war was the Battle of Viania, where the Marines errant attempted to establish a foothold in the system. Huron's forces let them land, let them think they had secured the planet, and then he trapped them. Using a combination of orbital bombardments and precision strikes, he isolated and destroyed entire companies before they even realized what was happening. It was a brutal wake-up call. The Loyalists weren't just fighting a rebellion. They were fighting a warlord who knew exactly how they operated, how they thought, and how to turn their tactics against them. Another thing that made this war different was the sheer variety of combat environments. This wasn't just fleet battles or planetary invasions. It was boarding actions, ambushes in asteroid fields, brutal trench warfare on fortress worlds, and sabotage missions that crippled entire war efforts. Every battle was different, and every victory came with a cost. There was no safe ground, no easy wins. As the war escalated, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a quick suppression campaign. The Imperium had underestimated Huron, and now they were paying for it. The Loyalists had the numbers, but Huron had the home field advantage. He knew the Maelstrom Zone better than anyone, and he used that knowledge to drag the Imperium into a war of attrition they weren't prepared for. And this is where we see just how different the Badab War was from something like the Horus Heresy. There was no single event that shattered the Imperium, no grand betrayal that shook the galaxy. Instead, it was a slow, brutal grind, a war where loyalty was tested, alliances were forged and broken, and Astartes were forced to make choices they never thought they would have to make. It was a war of strategy, endurance, and sheer willpower, fought not in the name of chaos or rebellion, but in the name of survival, power, and the ever-present weight of duty. But here's the thing. If the Imperium had underestimated Huron, Huron had underestimated the Imperium too. He believed he could win a war against the bureaucracy, against the weight of the Imperium's endless war machine. He thought that if he struck fast and struck hard, the High Lords would reconsider, that they might negotiate or at least acknowledge his rule. But the Imperium doesn't negotiate, it doesn't compromise, it doesn't bend. And that meant one thing. If Huron wouldn't surrender, then the Imperium would have to break him completely. The war had only just begun, but already, both sides knew the truth. This wasn't going to end with diplomacy, it was going to end with blood. The Badab War wasn't just another imperial war, it was a brutal, merciless Astartes civil war, and that made it something far worse. It wasn't like the usual conflicts where the Imperium throws the Astra Militarum at an enemy until the problem disappears under a mountain of corpses. This was different. This was Space Marine against Space Marine, warriors who were genetically enhanced to be the best of the best, trained to exterminate threats with terrifying precision. And when both sides were made up of these warriors, the result wasn't just war, it was slaughter on a scale rarely seen in the Imperium. This wasn't the Horus Heresy where one side had turned to chaos and could be written off as corrupted traitors. No, this was something far more disturbing. Loyal sons of the Emperor cutting each other down with no mercy, fighting for ideals that, in another reality, could have easily been switched. And that meant this war had no room for hesitation. There was no redemption for the losers, no way back. The moment the first blood was spilled, this became a war of total annihilation. The fighting was unlike anything the Imperium had seen in centuries. The Adeptus Astartes are designed to fight and kill efficiently. But what happens when both sides are equally skilled? Every battle turned into a test of who could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the other. There were no cannon fodder regiments, no endless tides of expendable troops. Every loss was personal. Every engagement was between warriors who knew exactly how their enemy fought. What made this war so uniquely horrifying was that both sides knew each other intimately. Space Marines train extensively in fighting Xenos, heretics, and chaos monstrosities, but fighting other Space Marines? That was something else entirely. Huron's forces knew exactly how the Imperium's Astartes would deploy, how they would advance, how they would think, and the Loyalists knew exactly how to exploit Huron's tactics in return. The result was a meat grinder of precision where every engagement was as much about outplaying the enemy as it was about brute strength. One of the defining aspects of the Badab War was the sheer desperation and savagery involved. This wasn't like a war against an alien race where there was a clear hierarchy of power. This was a war between equals, and that meant no one could afford to hold back. The usual rules of engagement? Completely ignored. Space Marines who once prided themselves on tactical discipline and honor were now butchering each other like animals, using ambush tactics, psychological warfare, and outright massacres to gain the upper hand. One of the most infamous examples of this was the Red Scorpion's assault on the Mantis Warriors. The Mantis Warriors had been some of Huron's most skilled and disciplined allies, using their fast, hit-and-run tactics to great effect. But when the Red Scorpions finally caught them on Tranquility, they didn't just win the battle. They systematically exterminated every last one of them, taking no prisoners. This wasn't about breaking enemy lines. This was about ensuring that the enemy never fought again. And it wasn't just the Loyalists being ruthless. Huron's forces were just as vicious, if not more so. His Astral Claws and their allies used shock and awe tactics, employing brutal boarding assaults, planetary firebombings, and strategic executions. The most infamous case was when they ambushed an entire Loyalist fleet, disabling their ships instead of destroying them outright, then slaughtering every survivor in cold blood. This wasn't just war, it was punishment, a statement to the Imperium that Huron would not be erased so easily. The most disturbing thing about this war was that for many of these Astartes, it was personal. They weren't fighting nameless Xenos or Chaos warbands. They were fighting brothers. Some of them had fought together in previous campaigns. Some had even trained together before their chapters went separate ways. And now, they were executing each other without hesitation. There are stories of Astartes recognizing old comrades on the battlefield, only to put a bolt round through their skulls without a second thought. And that's what makes the Badab War so haunting. It wasn't just the violence itself, it was the cold, calculated nature of that violence. Space Marines aren't driven by rage or emotion the way ordinary humans are. They fight with logic, precision, and ruthless efficiency. And that means when they do turn on each other, the results are absolutely horrifying. This war also pushed the Astartes into using weapons and tactics they would never normally employ against each other. Boarding actions weren't just about securing ships, they were annihilation missions, where entire companies were vented into space, cut down in brutal corridor firefights, or hacked apart in chainsword duels that lasted for hours. Orbital bombardments weren't just tactical strikes. They were used to wipe out entire strongholds, reducing centuries of history and honor to rubble. There was no mercy. Even the aftermath of battles was grim. Normally, when Space Marines fight Xenos or Chaos, there's an almost ritualistic aspect to victory. Cleansing the battlefield, honoring the fallen, reinforcing positions. In the Badab War, there was none of that. The victors would systematically execute survivors, destroy relics of the enemy chapter, and erase their legacy from history. This was about total domination, not just military victory. And the worst part? There was no glory in this war. No great speeches, no heroic last stands that would be remembered in legends. The Imperium does not celebrate wars between Astartes because it is shameful. Even the victors of the Badab War weren't treated as heroes, because how can there be heroes in a war where the Emperor's finest turned on each other? To this day, the legacy of the Badab War lingers. Some of the chapters that fought in it never recovered. The Lamenters were cursed even further, reduced to near extinction. The Mantis warriors and executioners were exiled, forced to prove their loyalty through centuries of suffering. Even some of the loyalist chapters suffered politically. Their actions questioned, their reputations forever tied to a war that should never have happened. And then there's Huron. The Imperium tried to wipe him out, to erase him from history, to make an example of what happens when Astartes defy Terra. But they failed. Huron is still out there, and the Red Corsairs are a constant reminder that the Imperium's brutality has consequences. The Badab War didn't just end, it mutated, shifting from a civil war into an ongoing campaign of vengeance and piracy that still haunts the Imperium to this day. That's what makes the Badab War so terrifying. It wasn't just another war. It was a lesson in what happens when loyalty is tested, when power corrupts, and when the Imperium's greatest warriors are forced to destroy each other. And the worst part? It could happen again. The Imperium is built on fragile alliances and unbreakable demands. If it happened once, it can happen again. And next time, the Imperium might not survive it. Every war has a moment where the tide shifts, where the side that once seemed unstoppable suddenly finds itself pushed back, bleeding and desperate. In the Badab War, that moment didn't come all at once. It wasn't a single battle or a decisive strike that sealed Huron's fate. It was a series of brutal, relentless engagements, each one chipping away at the power he had spent years building. And when the momentum shifted, it was like an avalanche. Once it started, there was no stopping it. For much of the war, Huron and his forces had the upper hand. They were fighting on home ground, using their knowledge of the Maelstrom Zone to outmaneuver and outlast the Imperium's assaults. The Loyalists, despite their superior numbers, found themselves losing ships, losing footholds, and bleeding resources at an unsustainable rate. The Astral Claws had turned Badab and its surrounding systems into a fortress, and breaking through it seemed almost impossible. But the thing about fighting the Imperium is that no matter how well you hold the line, they never stop coming. No matter how many victories Huron won, his enemies always had more ships, more Astartes, and more reinforcements waiting to be deployed. The Badab War wasn't just a test of tactics, it was a test of endurance. And in the long run, Huron couldn't win that fight. One of the first major turning points came when the Firehawks and Red Scorpions launched a full-scale assault on the Mantis Warriors' key stronghold of Tranquility. The Mantis Warriors had been one of Huron's most effective allies, using hit-and-run tactics to harass Imperial supply lines. But Tranquility was their heart, their staging ground, and when the Loyalists came for it, they came with absolute fury. The battle was nothing short of a massacre. The Red Scorpions, known for their zealous hatred of traitors, showed no mercy. The Mantis warriors fought desperately, knowing that if they lost this battle, they would lose everything. But no matter how skilled they were outgunned, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. The Firehawks and Red Scorpions broke their defenses, tore through their ranks, and left their chapter in ruins. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological one. For the first time, Huron's forces saw that they weren't just fighting a war, they were losing it. But if tranquility was a warning shot, the Battle of the Endymion Cluster was the hammer blow. This was where the war escalated into pure annihilation. The Imperium brought in more reinforcements, deploying even more Astartes chapters and expanding the warfront. Huron, knowing he couldn't afford to fight a purely defensive battle, launched a desperate counteroffensive, sending his fleets deep into Imperial-controlled space in an attempt to cut off their supply lines. It was a bold move, one that could have bought him more time if it had worked. But the Loyalists saw it coming, and when Huron's fleet made its move, they were waiting for him. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest void wars in Astartes history. A catastrophic clash of warships that left entire fleets burning, shattered, and drifting lifeless in the void. Boarding actions turned into butcher houses as Space Marines tore each other apart in the corridors of ruined battle barges. The Astral Claws fought like cornered animals, but they were still cornered. The cost of this battle was staggering. The Imperium lost entire companies of Astartes, their warships crippled and gutted. But the difference was, they could afford the losses. Huron couldn't. Every ship he lost, every veteran that fell, was irreplaceable. And the worst part? He knew it. From that point forward, it was a slow but inevitable collapse. The Imperium's forces, now reinforced beyond what Huron could handle, tightened the noose. System by system, fortress by fortress, the Loyalists pushed deeper into Huron's domain, tearing down everything he had built. Then came the siege of Badab itself, the final, bloody stand of the Astral Claws. This wasn't a battle. This was extermination. The Imperium threw everything they had at Huron's last stronghold, unleashing the full wrath of the Emperor's warriors. There was no retreat, no escape, no mercy. The Astral Claws fought with unmatched ferocity, knowing that they had nowhere left to run. And yet, even as the walls of Badab burned, Huron refused to surrender. He fought to the bitter end, leading his forces in brutal last-stand engagements, forcing the Imperium to bleed for every inch of ground. There were no negotiations, no pleas for mercy, just fire, blood, and the death of an empire that had once stood as the Imperium's shield. By the time the battle was over, Badab was nothing more than a graveyard. The Astral Claws had been broken, their chapter effectively wiped from history. But Huron, he wasn't dead. Somehow, against all odds, he survived. Wounded, half dead, but still breathing, he escaped into the maelstrom, taking what remained of his forces with him. And that's where the real tragedy of the Badab War comes full circle. Because in a way, Huron didn't lose. Yes, his empire was gone, his chapter was destroyed, and his name was forever burned into the annals of history as a traitor. But the Imperium didn't kill him. And because of that, the war never truly ended. Because Huron is still out there, and the Red Corsairs, his reborn warband of renegades, outcasts, and vengeful killers, are stronger than ever. The Imperium thought they could erase him, but they only gave him a new purpose. The Badab War was his first rebellion. It won't be his last. And that's the thing about wars like this. You can burn the battlefields, bury the dead, and rewrite the history books. But some wars, they never really end. The Badab War wasn't just about brute force. It wasn't a simple case of two armies clashing until one side couldn't fight anymore. This war was riddled with deception, shifting allegiances, and betrayals that turned the tide at critical moments. Some chapters switched sides. Some played both sides, and some were simply caught in a trap they couldn't escape. In many ways, the Badab War was just as much a war of politics and manipulation as it was a war of bolters and chainswords. One of the most fascinating aspects of this war is how not every chapter that fought for Huron truly wanted to be there. Some were loyal to him from the beginning, seeing his defiance of the Imperium as a necessary evil. Others, though, found themselves dragged into the conflict and forced to make impossible choices. And when things started turning against Huron, those impossible choices became even worse. Take the Lamenters. They weren't a chapter known for rebellion. If anything, they were the definition of tragic loyalty. Descended from the Blood Angels, they carried the curse, the Black Rage, already suffered more than most chapters could ever imagine. And yet, when the war began, they found themselves allied with Huron, caught in a situation where backing out meant death. They had been assigned to his command as part of the Maelstrom Warders, and when the Imperium declared war on him, the Lamenters had a brutal realization. They were on the wrong side, and there was no way out. For a time, they fought alongside Huron's forces, but there's a lot of debate about how committed they actually were. Some fans believe the Lamenters were never truly invested in Huron's rebellion, that they fought only because defection meant being labeled traitors anyway. Others argue that they simply chose the wrong allies and didn't realize it until it was too late. But whatever their reasons, the truth is that the Lamenters were looking for an escape. And when the opportunity came, they took it. In one of the most dramatic shifts of the war, the Lamenters surrendered to the Imperium. But this wasn't an act of cowardice, it was an act of survival. They negotiated a conditional surrender, hoping to spare what remained of their chapter. The Imperium, never one to forgive easily, didn't execute them outright, but they didn't exactly welcome them back with open arms either. The Lamenters were sentenced to a penitent crusade, essentially a form of exile, where they would have to fight on the most dangerous battlefields to prove their loyalty. And the worst part, they accepted it. They chose a future of endless suffering, rather than continue fighting in a war they no longer believed in. But the Lamenters weren't the only ones to shift allegiances. The Executioners were another chapter that found themselves questioning their place in the war. Unlike the Lamenters, the Executioners weren't sentimental. They were warriors who believed in oaths and honor, and their loyalty to Huron was based on those principles. But as the war dragged on, as it became clear that Huron wasn't just defying the Imperium, but actively trying to carve out his own empire, the Executioners began to have doubts. For them, the breaking point came when they realized just how far Huron was willing to go. They had sworn an oath to fight alongside him, but they had never sworn to commit genocide against their fellow Astartes. They started seeing his actions not as defiance against bureaucracy, but as outright treason against the Imperium itself. And that was something they couldn't abide. So they did the unthinkable. They turned against him. Instead of continuing to fight, they switched sides, defecting to the loyalist cause. This was a massive blow to Huron's war effort. The Executioners weren't just another chapter. They were one of his strongest military assets, a force known for their brutality and tactical prowess. Losing them meant losing key battles, and it accelerated his downfall. This is what makes the Badab War so unique. It wasn't just a straightforward rebellion where every faction remained committed to their cause. It was a war filled with doubt, shifting loyalties, and second-guessing. There were chapters that never wanted to fight in the first place, and when given the chance, they abandoned the war altogether. Others remained loyal to the end, even when it meant facing total annihilation. And then there were those who played a far more insidious role. The Minotaurs, for example, were a chapter that fought for the Imperium, but their motivations were anything but pure. Unlike other loyalist chapters that fought out of duty, the Minotaurs had a reputation for being brutal enforcers, used by the High Lords of Terra for the dirtiest jobs. Some believe they were specifically unleashed on the Badab War not to bring order, but to send a message that no chapter, no matter how powerful, could defy the Imperium and live. The Minotaurs didn't fight with honor or restraint. They fought with the single-minded goal of extermination, focusing their efforts on utterly destroying the Astral Claws and their allies. And when the war was over, they didn't suffer the way the other loyalist chapters did. They were rewarded. They grew in strength, received new resources, and walked away stronger than they had been before the war started. It's led many fans to speculate that the Minotaurs were never really there to fight a war. They were there to clean house, to execute a pre-planned purge that the High Lords had already signed off on long before the first shots were fired. The entire war raises disturbing questions about loyalty in the Imperium. Were the Lamenters ever truly traitors? Or were they just forced into a war they never wanted? Did the executioners actually betray Huron, or were they simply returning to the Imperium that they were always meant to serve? And were the Minotaurs actually loyalists, or were they just a tool for a much darker agenda? One thing is certain, trust is a rare commodity in the Imperium, and the Badab War is proof of that. It showed that loyalty isn't always clear-cut, that even Space Marines can be forced into situations where the lines between right and wrong become impossible to define. And in the end, it wasn't just about who won or lost, it was about who survived, and what they had to sacrifice to do so. Huron may have been the biggest loser of the war, but he wasn't the only one. The Lamenters never recovered. The executioners were forever scarred by their decision. And the Imperium? It learned an important lesson. That even its greatest warriors can turn against each other when pushed too far. And that might be the scariest part of all. Because if it happened once, it can happen again. And next time, the Imperium might not be able to contain the fire before it spreads across the galaxy. The end of the Badab War was not a clean victory. There were no triumphant parades, no great celebrations. There was only ruin, broken chapters, and the echoes of betrayal. When the last battle was fought and the Imperium stood victorious, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a tragedy that had gone too far, a war that had burned everyone involved. By the time the siege of Badab had ended, the astral claws were shattered. Their fortress world, once a proud symbol of their defiance, was reduced to a charred and broken husk. The Imperium's forces had fought through every corridor, every stronghold, cleansing the planet one brutal engagement at a time. There were no negotiations, no pleas for mercy, only bolter fire, chainswords, and the cold finality of extermination. But Huron? He wasn't there when the end came. At the height of the siege, when it became clear that his empire was collapsing, Huron vanished. His body was never found among the dead. Some thought he had died in the fighting, his corpse lost beneath the ruins. But the truth was far worse. Huron had survived, though barely. Gravely wounded, half his body torn apart by the war he had refused to abandon, he was dragged from the battlefield by his most loyal followers. The Imperium had taken everything from him. His chapter, his home, his empire, but they had failed to kill him. And that meant this war wasn't truly over. Huron escaped into the maelstrom, retreating into the chaotic, lawless void that he had once tried to control. And from there, he did something that many never saw coming. He rebuilt. He didn't die a forgotten rebel. He became something else entirely. He took the remnants of his shattered forces and forged a new identity, a new purpose, a new army. He was no longer the chapter master of the Astral Claws. That name was dead. From the ashes of his defeat, he became the tyrant of Badab, the lord of the Red Corsairs, a pirate king who would terrorize the Imperium for centuries to come. His former allies, however, were not so lucky. The Mantis warriors, the Lamenters, and the Executioners had all fought for Huron, and for that, they paid a heavy price. The Imperium does not forget betrayal, no matter the reasons. But unlike the Astral Claws, they were not wiped out. Instead, they were given a different kind of punishment, one arguably worse than death. The Mantis warriors and Executioners were sent into exile, forced into penitent crusades where they would have to prove their loyalty to the Imperium through endless bloodshed. Their penance was brutal, with no guaranteed redemption, only the promise of slow, grueling atonement. They would fight on the most dangerous battlefields, sent on missions that few would survive, all in the hopes that one day the Imperium might forgive them. And the Lamenters? Their fate was even crueler. They had surrendered, throwing themselves at the mercy of the Imperium, hoping that their plea for redemption would be heard. It wasn't. They were sentenced to a century-long penitent crusade, but the reality was far worse. Every battle they fought, every campaign they were thrown into, only brought them closer to extinction. The Lamenters were already cursed with misfortune, and the Badab War only made it worse. Some fans even argue that their punishment was a death sentence disguised as redemption, that the High Lords of Terra simply wanted them to fade away, to be erased from history without the spectacle of outright execution. But what about the so-called victors? Did the Loyalist chapters walk away unscathed? Not even close. The Firehawks, Minotaurs, Red Scorpions, and other Loyalist chapters that had fought in the war had won. But at what cost? Many had suffered crippling losses, entire companies wiped out in battles that should never have happened in the first place. And worse, they now carried the stain of having fought in a war against their own kind. The Imperium does not like to talk about the Badab War, because it is a reminder of the Imperium's own failures that nearly tore apart its most elite warriors. And the Minotaurs? They came out of the war stronger than before, rewarded with new ships, new resources, and even more power. Some say that they were never truly just another chapter in this war, but rather the Imperium's executioners, unleashed to purge the astral claws in the most brutal way possible. Whether or not that's true, one thing is certain: the Minotaurs walked away from the Badab War as one of the most feared and ruthless chapters in the galaxy. The war left deep scars that never fully healed. The Maelstrom, once a contested battleground, became a lawless haven for renegades, pirates, and chaos warbands, with Huron and his Red Corsairs ruling from the shadows. Even though the Imperium had technically won, the cost of that victory was staggering. It had nearly destroyed multiple chapters, drained Imperial resources, and most importantly, it had proven just how fragile Astartes' loyalty could be when pushed too far. And that's the real legacy of the Badab War. It wasn't just about one man's rebellion or a single chapter's defiance. It was about the nature of loyalty, power, and the fine line between heroism and treason. The Imperium tells its citizens that the Adeptus Astartes are unbreakable, unwavering, and eternally loyal. But the Badab War proved that even the Emperor's greatest warriors are not immune to doubt, ambition, and self-preservation. The war ended, but its consequences never truly disappeared. Huron still lurks in the void, his Red Corsairs growing stronger with each passing century, launching raids against Imperial worlds, stealing ships, and corrupting new recruits. The chapters that survived still bear the shame of what happened, and those that perished are nothing more than whispers in forgotten records. And if history tells us anything, it's that wars like this don't stay buried forever. The Imperium may have put out the fire, but the embers are still smoldering. And one day, when the conditions are right, when another leader like Huron rises, when the weight of the Imperium's tyranny becomes too much, it will happen again. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And the Badab War? It was just a taste of the next great betrayal waiting to happen. The Badab War may have ended, but its consequences never truly faded. The Imperium doesn't like to talk about it, doesn't want to admit that one of the worst wars in recent history wasn't caused by chaos, Xenos, or some ancient prophecy, but by its own failures. It was a war between the Emperor's finest, not because of heresy or corruption, but because of bureaucracy, stubbornness, and the impossible demands of a failing empire. And the scars of that war are still etched into the Imperium and the Adeptus Astartes to this day. One of the most immediate consequences was the permanent stain it left on the reputation of Space Marine chapters. Before the Badab War, the Adeptus Astartes were seen as almost beyond question. They were the Emperor's angels of death, warriors who stood apart from the petty power struggles of the Imperium's bureaucracy. But the Badab War shattered that illusion. It proved that even Space Marines could be corrupted by ambition, paranoia, and self-preservation. It forced the Imperium to acknowledge that chapters could rebel, not because of chaos, but because of internal politics and bad leadership. This led to an increase in oversight and paranoia from the High Lords of Terra. The Badab War had shown that Astartes, when left unchecked, could carve out their own power bases, defy imperial orders, and even wage war against their own brothers. And so the Imperium tightened its grip. More inquisitorial scrutiny, more administrative interference, more watchful eyes on Space Marine chapters that grew too powerful or too independent. The Codex Astartes, already the backbone of many chapters, became even more strictly enforced. The idea of any chapter growing too large, too centralized, or too influential became a dangerous thought, something that could bring immediate suspicion from the Imperium's higher authorities. Some fans even argue that the Badab War was a warning to every chapter in the galaxy, a reminder that if they step too far out of line, they will be crushed, just like the astral claws were. And then there's the psychological toll. The war may have ended, but its survivors, on both sides, never truly escaped it. The Lamenters, forever cursed by their misfortune, were sent on a penitent crusade that nearly wiped them out. The Mantis warriors and executioners were forced into exile, cast out into the void to prove their loyalty through endless war. Even some of the loyalist chapters, like the Red Scorpions and the Firehawks, found themselves forever associated with a war that should never have happened. The Minotaurs, on the other hand, came out stronger than ever. Their brutal efficiency in eradicating the astral claws earned them favor with the High Lords, leading to increased resources, new recruits, and more strategic deployments. Some suspect that the Minotaurs weren't just another loyalist chapter in this war. They were the Imperium's enforcers, a tool used to ensure that other chapters knew exactly what would happen if they defied Terra. And what about the man who started it all? Luft Huron may have lost the war, but he was never truly defeated. If anything, the Badab War created something far worse than the tyrant of Badab. It created the Red Corsairs. Huron didn't die with his chapter. He escaped into the Maelstrom, broken but unbowed, and over time, he rebuilt. No longer constrained by imperial law or the expectations of honor, he turned the Red Corsairs into one of the most dangerous renegade forces in the galaxy. And that's one of the biggest ironies of the Badab War. The Imperium fought to prevent Huron from becoming a warlord, yet their own actions are what pushed him into becoming something even worse. Before, he was just a rebellious chapter master with an overblown ego and an empire of his own making. Now, he's a legendary terror of the void, a force that has recruited thousands of renegades, seized entire fleets, and continues to raid, pillage, and spread anarchy across Imperial space. The Imperium won the war, but it failed to kill the idea of Huron, and that idea still haunts them to this day. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Badab War is the doubt it created. Before, wars between space marines were almost unthinkable outside of the Horus Heresy. Now, every chapter in the Imperium knows that it can happen again. The High Lords may preach that the Adeptus Astartes are eternally loyal, that no chapter would ever truly rise against them again. But the Badab War proved otherwise. It proved that loyalty is fragile, that Astartes are not mindless servants, and that under the right conditions, another war like this could erupt. And maybe that's the real fear the Imperium carries. The Badab War was only one system, only a handful of chapters, and yet it nearly tore the Astartes apart. If something bigger were to happen, if entire sectors of Space Marines turned against the Imperium at once, could Terra even survive it? Some fans even argue that the Badab War was a prelude to something far worse. The Imperium is constantly at war, constantly demanding more from its Astartes, constantly pushing them to sacrifice everything for a crumbling empire that gives them nothing in return. How long before another chapter finds itself in the same position as the Astral Claws? How long before another leader like Huron emerges, defiant and unwilling to bow? Because in the end, the Badab War wasn't just about one chapter rebelling. It was about what happens when the Imperium demands too much from its warriors, when politics overrides reason, and when loyalty is tested to its breaking point. And the scariest part? The Imperium didn't learn from it. It simply buried the records, punished the survivors, and moved on. But history has a way of repeating itself, and when it does, the Badab War will seem like nothing compared to what comes next. The Badab War is one of those stories in Warhammer 40k that sticks with you. It's not about chaos invasions, ancient Xenos threats, or the grand battles of the Horus Heresy. It's something more unsettling, more personal. A war where Space Marines, the very defenders of the Imperium, turned their bolters on each other, not because of some dark prophecy or demonic corruption, but because of politics, pride, and the sheer weight of imperial bureaucracy crushing those who couldn't keep up. And that's what makes it so important. Because the Badab War could happen again. In a galaxy where the Imperium constantly pushes its warriors to the brink, where chapters are expected to follow impossible demands without question, where the High Lords of Terra see even their greatest defenders as expendable assets, how long before another chapter reaches its breaking point? How long before another leader like Luft Huron rises, refuses to submit, and declares that he will rule his own fate? That's the real lesson of the Badab War. It wasn't about good versus evil. It wasn't about heretics versus loyalists. It was about what happens when loyalty is tested beyond reason. Was Huron truly a traitor? Or was he just a space marine who realized the Imperium wasn't worth dying for? Was the Imperium truly justified in its response? Or did it create the very monster it feared by forcing Huron into rebellion? The echoes of this war never really faded. Even though the Imperium buried it in its records, even though it tried to move on as if it had never happened, the consequences still linger. The Lamenters are still suffering for their role in the war, exiled to a crusade that will probably never end. The Red Corsairs are still raiding Imperial space, growing stronger with every world they plunder. And the Imperium? It remains just as rigid, just as blind, just as unwilling to learn from its own mistakes. And that's why the Badab War remains one of the most fascinating chapters in Warhammer 40k history. It's not just another war, it's a warning. A reminder that the Imperium isn't some perfect, all-knowing force of righteousness. It is flawed, paranoid, and sometimes its greatest enemies are the ones it creates for itself. It's proof that Space Marines are not unbreakable. That given the right push, even the most loyal chapters can become the next renegades, the next warlords, the next threats that the Imperium will be forced to destroy. So if you think the Badab War was a one-time event, think again. The seeds of rebellion are always there. The Imperium is stretched thinner than ever. Its enemies are more numerous than they have ever been, and its warriors are constantly asked to give more than they have. It's only a matter of time before another chapter, another leader, another Huron decides that they're done following orders, and that they would rather fight for their own survival than die for a corrupt empire. And when that happens, the Imperium will once again turn on its own, because that's what it does best. But hey, that's just the grimdark reality of Warhammer 40k. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the Badab War and want more deep dives into the darkest, bloodiest, and most fascinating parts of 40k lore, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. There are still so many stories to uncover, so many battles to dissect, and so many secrets buried in the grim darkness of the far future. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.